Well, heroin use and deaths are at a record high, but the biggest increase comes from two demographics you might not expect: the women and the wealthy. According to the CDC, from 2002 to 2013, the number of women using heroin doubled. In people with an annual income of more than $50,000, heroin use is up 60%. And the number of young adults using heroin, ages 18 to 25, that number has more than doubled in that time. Also, the number of overdose deaths has nearly quadrupled. Here to explain why the sudden surge is Sanho Tree, the director of Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Sanho, thank you so much for being here today. So why are more people, especially more affluent people, turning to heroin in recent years? Basically, what's this spike all about?
They're not getting it, from dealers on the streets. That's not their point of introduction these days. It's coming from prescription drugs. They're getting their initial contact through doctors who mean well, but some of them are overprescribing, and some doctors, it should be pointed out, are underprescribing because they're afraid of getting in trouble with the DEA. So there are a lot of people in pain who need pain relief aren't getting it, but many others are getting too much, and they're getting too many refills on their prescriptions, and they become addicted to OxyContin or Percocet. And once they crack down, the government cracks down on this, the black market prices for these drugs becomes astronomically high. And there's a very cheap alternative, which is street heroin, which is very, very cheap and doesn't require a prescription. And
very dangerous. I want to pull up a full screen that we have that kind of shows an example of how people are getting addicted to heroin. If you take a look, if you use alcohol, apparently you are 2 times more likely to become addicted to heroin, marijuana 3 times, cocaine 15 times, and then you look, that's crazy, 40 times. If you take opiate painkillers and you are addicted to them, you're 40 times more likely to go to heroin.
Well, so there are lots of different entry points, right? And this is very cyclical. So this is something that certain cohorts will experience, and the next cohorts, the next generation, learn from that experience. So when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, the word on the street was don't do meth. Meth kills. No matter what else, you don't do meth. And so as peers, we taught each other, whatever you do, don't do that. That gets a bad reputation. In the 80s and 90s, it was crack on the streets. So the younger generation saw their older siblings go through this terrible experience that becomes an extremely unfashionable drug for a generation or two. And so this is another cycle we're going through with heroin.
Now, there's some misconception as to where the U.S. is getting their supply, because Afghanistan supplies the vast majority of the world's heroin.
Right. Historically, though, it comes from the United States gets our heroin, especially east of the Mississippi River, from Colombia and Mexico, and a little bit through Guatemala as well. They've always produced it. It's easy to produce, and it'll grow in all 50 states if it comes to that. So it's difficult to stop.
It's interesting you mentioned east of the Mississippi, because when we think about it, it's not just a problem in inner cities right now, but suburbs. But not just suburbs, really Midwest, Northeast, those areas. But wouldn't you assume it would have been the border states that would have had a bigger struggle with this?
Not necessarily. There are lots of different factors that go into it. We got Rust Belt areas. You've got all kinds of. In some states, it's much easier to obtain these prescription drugs, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily that the supply shows up and people suddenly decide they want to inject heroin. So all the preconditions are different.
So when it comes down to it, how do we tackle this problem, what some experts are considering an epidemic?
Every time we go through a drug scare, a drug craze, the media goes on overload very often and hyperinflates a problem, which then gets draconian political solutions from politicians. They want to look like they're doing something, and sometimes doing something is worse than doing nothing, because sometimes the remedy is worse than the cure, and the unintended consequences are, we get our prisons filled, it's hard to promote harm reduction, they want to crack down. And so very often being tough is the opposite of being effective. And so the political message that's going out is different from the public health message, and we need to learn from the public health side of things how to handle this problem.
And is this a health epidemic?
This is absolutely a health problem, and this is why law enforcement should not take the lead role in this, right? For what other forms of public health do we use police and prosecutors in prisons as the primary means of making people better? I mean, would we cure clinical depression with a baseball bat? Smile or I'll beat you again. You don't coerce people into being better. You look at why people choose to self-medicate, and I think that it gets into a whole lot of other societal questions that we need to explore.
Okay, great. Sanho Tree, Director of Drug Policy at the Institute of Policy Studies. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.